that second one about basically not making the call, I do that a lot. It changed. I think after year 4, I basically just became a big boy. I was like, come on, man, just make the call because it doesn't matter. And I think from that decision making was when my entire perspective changed.
All right, welcome to another episode of Create Lab. I have a special guest here for you today, Timo Armoo. Welcome to the show, man.
What's up? How are you? Good?
Yeah, good to have you on, man. We got introduced by a mutual friend. I think someone who had interviewed you for another pod. I'd seen your name floating around town. You're a London boy like me as well, so we had to get this in the books, man. So thanks for coming on. We're going to be talking all about influencer marketing, you selling your agency for tens of millions of dollars or pounds, however you want to, whatever currency you want to use nowadays. So look, man, before we do that, I don't normally have too many people from London like me on the show. So we need to get back to the basics. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what it was like growing up for you there.
Yeah, I grew up here in London. Well, I was born in Hackney, but then I went to live in Ghana for 10 years. And then I came back to live here when I was, 10. And then I've basically been a South London boy ever since. So pretty much it's been a London boy. I think it's probably the greatest city in the world. I've been to several different cities, and I'm always arguing with people as to why London is the better city in the world. So
there we go.
That's the story.
Where were you in Ghana, by the way?
I was in a place called East Legon. East Legon is in Accra. So my grandma was actually like the first. She says this, but I don't know if it's, true. I hope it is, because I've told a lot of people this, but she was the first ever person to live in East Legon. And East Legon is kind of like, I'm trying to pick a parallel in London. East Legon, maybe kind of like Shoreditch, maybe towards. Actually, no. East Legon is like Hampstead Heath, so it's like the fancy.
Oh, very different. Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Yeah. So it's quite a fancy place in Ghana. She says she was the first ever person who lived there because she, like, before there was forestry and all that stuff.
Got it.
Well. But yeah.
So she made it home.
I lived for 10 years, exactly.
Got it. All right, cool. Well, we might get back to some of those roots in a little bit as well. But let's paint a picture for people who you are, why I invited you on the show. You started a company called Fanbytes. You sold that to Brain Labs for, it says at 8 figures. Brain Labs was actually started by Daniel Gilbert, a guy who's worked with me 12 years ago. We were in Google, Dublin together, a really funny dude. I don't know if he's still funny, but he was he would be dressing up in like Superman outfits and doing funny stuff like that. So yeah, good energy.
The first time I met Dan, just going through the whole acquisition process, because we had a bunch of, we had 4 companies who were interested in buying Fanbytes. And just the first time that I met Dan, I thought, you are just you leave such an impression that if your company is like this, then I can see how it could be a good home for Fanbytes. So there's something to be said for almost the strength of a founder, the spirit of a founder, and how that can really translate throughout the company. So yeah, he is still as what's the word? He is still as...
I've got a few words to describe him, but I'll keep them in my head for now.
Well, just like cool and zany and visionary. He's still that same person. So
that's good to hear.
Cool.
That's good to hear, man. All right. Well, and so for people who don't know Fanbytes, could you paint a picture of what it is, what it was when you started it? I think you started it more than 5 years ago.
Yeah. So I started it when I was 21, and really it was... I saw the rise of influencer marketing. I saw the rise of people like Zoella, KSI, really influencing the purchasing decisions, purchasing habits of Gen Z. And so I was like, well, for every new medium, whether it's PR, radio, TV, anytime there's a new medium, it always starts off as an independent thing. and then eventually, and then eventually it then becomes part of a bigger thing. And so for me, I saw that opportunity and I knew, right, what we're going to try and do here is like leverage that opportunity. I was someone who was part of the Gen Z audience, so I just understood how to engage them. So the whole company was all around, there's this wave going on social, there's this wave going on influencers. Brands are going to need to understand how to work with them in order to reach that Gen Z audience. And then that was pretty much the simple thesis. And then we're off to the races.
That's it. And so, and then you work with companies like Nike, Deliveroo, Samsung, even the UK government, I have written here in my notes. So like, you know, plus I think a lot more than that. And it looks like you had 70 people in the company at one point. I don't know what the numbers are nowadays, but basically an agency that grew, fast growth, you ride in the wave, but you're native to that audience. You're not just an academic or someone who's like, 50 years old saying, here's how to target Gen Z. I had the same when I was coming up in advertising as well. I'm a millennial, so everyone was like, how do we reach millennials? And we got to do a hashtag, like that sort of stuff. And it was like, you don't really, you could tell the difference between someone who's living in the culture within the age group. So you guys were native to that. But what I think is interesting with you is a lot of people who come from that age group don't necessarily have the entrepreneurial skills or the maturity to actually turn it into a proper company. So today we'll be breaking a part of that down, the process, hiring people, figuring out how to grow, all that sort of stuff. So, and then we will also be touching on influencer marketing specifically in the second half of the show.
Sounds good.
So, but before we do that, I do want to talk about this idea of like selling companies, because I've had people on the show like Andrew Wilkinson who goes and buys companies, and other private equity folks who basically go out and buy companies for a living. So if you're interested in that and you're listening for the first time, you can go and check out some of those episodes. But I haven't had that many people who have come on and said, this is how you go and sell a company. And I mean, people have been on the show that have sold the companies, but not necessarily the way I heard you describe it in our exchange before. So I want to talk a bit about this idea, like setting up a company from day one, reverse engineering, selling a company or an exit. So is that something going into building the company you were like, oh, I want to sell this one day? Was that something day one you thought?
So I think I have a very simple framework, which is that there's 4 outcomes for any business. 1 is that the business fails. 2 is that the business gets passed on to your kids. 3 is that the business goes public. And 4 is that the business gets bought at some point, right? And so starting it at 21, I knew the business was not going to fail. I was also young and I knew this business was not going to be something I'd pass to my kids because I wasn't even thinking about that. The third one was I knew that the nature of this business being like a tech-enabled services business was not one that could go public. And so the fourth most logical outcome was for it to be acquired. And so I think a big part of that then was, how do we create enough value where at some point where there is market consolidation, then there will be some kind of exit. And that was definitely a key part of the way that I constructed the company. Even from the type of funding that we raised or the way that we raised funding, it was all engineered to ensure that we had enough optionality when it came to then being able to sell the company. Because there were a lot of people, when I was running the business, there were a lot of people who effectively thought that success was this sort of business being $1 billion business. So they build software, influencer SaaS tools, raise tens of millions, and then they're now valued at like 80 million, and they can't get any liquidity because it's,
and they might own like 4% of the company a lot of the time. Yeah,
exactly. Right. Like they can't get any liquidity. The whole SaaS and software part of the business is primarily useless. And so what you end up seeing them doing is trying to merge with other SaaS players. And it's kind of laughable. Like I see that and I just go, come on, guys. Did you really think this was going to be some billion-dollar play? And so I think that's one thing. Founders are not that honest with themselves about the outcome. And I think going into it, I was very honest with myself about the outcome, and that's what happened.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people I've had on the show are very much in that other mode, which is, you know, Silicon Valley style venture backed startups. And then that was kind of early Creator Lab. And then later I've had a lot more kind of solopreneurs or people who bootstrapped. And I actually have become very attracted to that style of business. And so there's pros and cons, obviously, to all of these. A lot of the time, an agency business is not seen as that sexy. It's seen as like, oh, okay, like quite a lot of hard work, very capital intensive in terms of, well, labor intensive more so than capital intensive. But the great thing is, the flip side is, you can start making money from day one, right? And you would make money from day one if you're charging people for a service and not just building something that one day you're going to monetize. So but we're going to come onto that in a little while. But to take a step back, this wasn't the first time you sold a company. So I saw you had, at 14, you had a company called Alpha Tutoring, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that was the tutoring project.
That was your tutoring
Not even
thing?
a company, to be honest.
Yeah, just like
I would call that like a tutoring project, because it was the first thing that opened up my eyes to the whole world of business. And I was like, that's interesting.
Like as a student, exactly. And then the one that you did actually sell, you were 17, you had something called Entrepreneur Express. What was that? You sold it in like a year. What sort of a company was that?
So that was pretty much like an online business blog. And the thing, so that got sold to a agency now. I think they've rebranded, but they were called like Horizon Media. And basically it was actually just these two brothers who had started it. And the whole thing was they wanted to own like niche blogs and niche publications. Eventually, it kind of just became an agency. But yeah, that was all around business and tech and all that sort of stuff. But the reason they really were interested in it was because we were able to drive distribution through Facebook pages and Facebook accounts.
Got it.
That was
all right. So that was like your first.
That was like 11 years ago, because I'm 28 now. Yeah. So that was 11 years ago, in the heyday of when Facebook was just, giving out views for free.
Yeah, organic reach is through the roof. Like you can share anything and people would see it. So, and that's kind of like, we're going to get onto influencer marketing in the second half of the show. But I'm a marketer too. Like I have a background in digital marketing, and so the way I've always done it, and I had a small e-commerce business and stuff when I was a kid as well. And basically, my whole mind always goes to like, where's the kind of arbitrage opportunity? Like maybe that's not the best way to describe it, but when you said there like Facebook pages, like that was, if you knew about Facebook pages in whatever year it was, right? You were getting crazy distribution. If you knew PPC in the 2000s, like Google AdWords, or even early 2010s, to be honest, or Facebook ads, you were going to crush it. And so I think influencer marketing for the last 5 to 7 years has been like, this huge untapped thing where people, now everyone's doing it. But like when you were starting the company, it was very early. People like, why would I give free products to these people? So, and I'm curious now to get your take later on where we are in 2023. So you sold that company as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, even on that, you use the phrase arbitrage, but I think it's more what I call like the expertise gap. That's actually the way that I see it, that I see it more as an expertise gap, right? So right now, if you're starting a digital marketing agency, you probably shouldn't do that. And the reason why is because the expertise gap, i.e. the gap between what you know and what the prospective client knows, is much smaller because there's so much information about how to do XYZ. Whereas at the beginning, 2017, when we're doing the whole thing around the influencer community, it was like there was a significant gap about how to create content with them, how to work with them, who are the right ones. And now over time with in-housing and a bunch of other things, the gap has reduced. So, often I'd have people come to me and say, I want to start like an influencer company. And I say, you should categorically not do this because because the gap is smaller. And the only way it makes sense is for it to be inside of a bigger ecosystem. If your whole thing is solely an influencer business, that's not going to work. So I 100% agree about the market being probably the most important marker of success. And really what you're trying to look for is the gaps, like the expertise gaps, because
I like that phrase a lot. Yeah.
There, then you win.
That's a great phrase, yeah, because and that's why I was hesitant to even say arbitrage, because I actually don't. The way I actually really see it, I was just thinking out loud there, is more like I like finding value in things, right? Like where I'm like, oh, people don't know about this enough yet, and it's an area where I'm interested in naturally, and I'm going to learn all about it before other people do. And it's similar to what you said, expertise gap. So, and obviously in technology, there's a lot of that. So since we're talking about it, we're in 2023 right now. If you were advising, you've got your little cousin coming to you, or your little, family member or friend, and they're 22, and they're saying, hey man, you've had this success with the agency. What are those areas that you're now seeing in 2023 where you think there's an expertise gap to be had, where someone listening could say, oh, I didn't realize that's an area that I should be learning about?
A good question. So I think there's probably something to be said for owning an audience. And the audience could be your personal brand, or it could just be an audience of deeply passionate people. So, for example, there's I've seen people do incredibly well where they own a very niche blog around horoscopes, or a niche blog around something like the 16 personalities test. Yeah. And I just generally have started to see the value of audience is a lot more than just their followers. And I would tell them, look for something that people are passionately interested in, where there's a huge amount of depth, and then go and build an audience in that particular niche. So I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I'm also very interested in, everyone's talking about generative AI and all that. I mean, yeah, that's all cool and fine, but I think that the application for that is generative AI to hyper-personalize things for people. So by that, can you use it as an engine to build a print-on-demand brand for people who are into a certain type of animal, or who are into a certain type of sport? I think those are very interesting things, because if you go back to my earlier point about the expertise gap, right now there's an expertise gap in that whole space. So you need to kind of fill that gap before, in 2-3 years, that gap is filled and it's not possible to build anything of significance there.
Yeah, that's a great answer, actually. Yeah, I think just to relay what I heard from you, to see if there's anything else to add there. Like you mentioned the niche blogs. I think the horoscope one, there's a guy who I actually had on the show who actually did something like that. So I wasn't sure if you're talking about him, but a guy called Ramon. But
yeah.
I think he did. Company. Yeah, he's got the dog ramp company, but he's done so many. I think he had some sort of horoscope, or he's had like so many blogs, and he's like the king of the most random. Like every time I speak to him, I'm like, "Oh, what you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, I've just bought this dog ramp business, and now it's doing like 30 million in revenue." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? What is a dog ramp business?"
Yeah, one of the things I've been doing recently is like funding a bunch of niche audience companies. So I funded a bunch in the dog space, but like a specific type of dog, or helping out people who are building stuff in very niche industries like the agriculture industry, where the average order value is incredibly high, but there's maybe only 300,000 people who would be great for that, but they are people who
but they're spending a lot more money.
Exactly. That's a very interesting play. This kind of like monetization of niche audiences. And I've been doing that a lot, kind of like funding those ideas. And what's great about those is they are incredible cash flow businesses, right from the off. And the exit optionality is a lot higher, because you just sell to someone else who wants to reach that audience.
Yeah. And also, like in those groups, if you think of like a network of people, those people are congregating either online or in person, and they know each other, and they're like to turn this into a marketing phrase you talk about. I think like R value or R factor or whatever, how things spread essentially. Like
the K factor.
The K factor. Sorry, I was saying the wrong one. K factor. The K factor is just way higher generally because people are like in that niche community together, so that makes sense. Yeah. 100%. All right, cool. That was I'm glad I asked that. So we talked about why you went into it with those 4 different outcomes for business. Let's talk about your deal. Obviously, you're not necessarily able to say all the numbers or whatever, but when you're going to that position to sell an agency specifically, what are the kind of factors that are being looked at, and how do you figure out? I mean, you mentioned why you sold to them, not the other 3 companies that were interested. But in terms of valuation for an agency, is it as simple as it's X, 2, 4, 5X, 10X profit a year? Or how do they value a company like that?
No, not at all. I mean, it kind of depends on who you want or who the buyer is, right? If they're a financial buyer or a strategic buyer. So in our case, Brain Labs were a strategic buyer. And so the question they're asking here is, sure, you've got good profit, sure, you've got a good team, and sure, you've got good stuff. But at the time that we sold the company, we were 75 people, and Brain Labs were, 900, right? So it's not as if there's, it's not as if there was going to be some insane amount of revenue that a 75-person company could bring to a 900-person company. Having said that, I think for them, it was very much about what the strategic potential could be by being able to bring on influencer marketing into their capability set. And what
then they can sell that across the rest of their books, right?
Yes, exactly. And so I think when people are often thinking about trying to sell their companies or not even trying to sell the companies, just like any sort of acquisition, I think a lot of them discount the fact that someone is not just buying you because they like your haircut, right? Like there is a business decision being made here, and it is, if we add on this company as part of us, are we going to end up making more money? And so at the base level, yes, you need to have good profits, you need to have good revenue and good, customer portfolio. But it's also, if we add on this company into what we are doing, are we going to make more money? And that was
it's a multiplication for them, not just addition, right?
Exactly.
Like, that makes a lot of sense. All right.
But I think that's different for like a financial buyer, right? Like, Before we actually began a process, we were approached by 2 private equity groups, and their whole thing was, okay, well, what is your EBIT? What is your revenue? Let's multiply that, and this is the number. There was no story of growth there because fundamentally they were focused on the hard numbers and the multiplication of EBIT. So I think in those 2 separate circumstances, you need to just understand. One of them, you are telling a story which is primarily of the numbers, that's the financial buyer. And then the other, you are telling a story of growth and strategic potential whilst having the foundation of being a solid company with solid profit and solid revenue.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I like that. That's definitely useful. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you grew the company early on, because I know a lot of people who have agencies, and there's normally like some revenue thresholds or number of employee thresholds that quite hard to break through. So I'm curious to hear, if I said to you in the 5-6 years, whatever it was that you were building that before you sold, what was like the 80-20 of getting new clients essentially, right? So like if you could look back and say those are the things that actually generated and drove new client relationships, that the accounts that landed the best clients for you guys, like what are the different kind of, like a pie chart, I guess, of the types of activities that will get that? And so I think a couple of things. So first of all, I think what's important for us to have been
for us to have been able to achieve the revenue that we did, I think it was very important for us to have a tech enablement. So, for example, our platform that we use to run campaigns, influencer identification, was all tech tools that we had built to help us scale. Otherwise, to get to the level that we wanted to be at, there is no way on earth we'd have been able to do that with 75 people. And that was a very conscious decision, because I was like, okay, the way that we're going to scale is we're not going to scale directly just through hiring more people. So that's just a precursor to understand that I think for people who run agency companies, I think if you really want to think about scale, you can scale through people or scale through tech, which just drives a lot more like
more leverage
cost down. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's very key. To answer your question, I think our biggest thing was really content marketing. Like, I generally had a disdain for kind of cold email, cold sales, hard sales, but that was just because before I actually started Fanbytes, so I think in like the early stages, I was reading a lot of books about internet marketing. So Russell Brunson's of the world and ClickFunnels and all that stuff. And I was fascinated by the idea of being able to create content which brings people into your world, gets them to raise their hand, which means that you're not in a position of weakness going to them and saying, can you please spend with us? They're actually coming to you. And so actually, even to the day that the company was acquired, I think 92% of our new biz revenue was all inbound. And that is everyone from, Nike, Deliveroo, Samsung, all of these people. Because what we did very well was create content, which then brought people in, whether it was through webinars or events, so all that stuff. So that's one, on a very tactical level, that's the way that we did it. And then probably the biggest thing, to be honest, the biggest thing that we did, and I think that we did this way too late, was that we went upstream, probably in year 4. We went upstream.
Do you mean price point wise, or like
price point wise and value wise? So what happened was, at the beginning, we were like, we connect you to these influencers and cool. And then we started involving things around strategy, and that therefore meant we could price a lot higher. And then we went like strategy, insights, and activation all around your influencer campaign and how it feeds into your broader social media. And instantly that was, 6-figure budgets. So I think what we ended up doing was just like scaling up in value. And then also by using this content marketing approach, we're able to bring a lot of people in rather than us going out to them.
Got it. And when you say 6-figure budgets, is that the budgets that are being paid to your agency, or you're saying the budgets of the campaigns?
That's the budget to us. To
being paid as like a retainer, like
or whatever. 500 grand, 300 grand,
Got
400 grand, 250 grand.
Great.
At the beginning, when all we were almost like, come to us, we'll help you find these influencers, etc. Maybe it'll be 10 grand or 20 grand.
And just to paint a specific picture for people, generally how agencies, if you're listening, you've never heard how agencies make money. Normally you're charging for a service, it's a service business. You either get paid some in a media agency, you'd normally get like either a monthly retainer, which is just a flat fee, or you get a percentage of media, which is essentially the same thing. They're basically charging for the scale and the workload of your team. But what you guys are doing, what I heard was you went from charging, let's say 10K for, hey, we'll match you up with some influencers, to, hey, we've built a tech-enabled platform. We've got all these extra insights for you. We're doing the strategy and execution. So you just said, we're going to just take over your influencer marketing. And for that, we're going to charge 100 grand a year, 200 grand a year. Is that per year, I'm assuming?
No. So one of the things that we didn't do that well, and in hindsight, I think that we could have done it if we had thought more about insights first, was we did a lot of things on a project basis. Now, we did have a few retainers, and we had a decent amount of repeat revenue, but we didn't have a lot of retained revenue.
Got it.
Which over time we kept having, more and more. And by that, I mean, in an ideal world, if if 70% of your business could be retained, that's very cool. We had less than that, not bad at all. I'm not quite sure what the number was, but I do remember thinking, if we had thought about it a bit more strategically, we could have had a lot more retained. But they were primarily
it's more project based. Got it. So they say we're going to activate like Deliveroo. We've got a campaign for Christmas. For the next 3 months, you guys work with us. And got you. Okay. And I think for influencer marketing, that makes more sense versus like my background is more media agency where it's like, oh, we've got evergreen campaigns for Facebook, Google, stuff like that. But that's interesting. And so just to go on the pricing part though, that is quite, even just as the founder and that mental thing of like asking for more and being like, oh, I'm asking someone for 10 grand. Now I'm going to ask for 200 grand. And like, I'm just curious, putting yourself back in the shoes you were then, like thinking that through. Yeah. How do you even figure out the pricing in something like that? Obviously you can speak to people, but yeah.
So I've got 2 points on that. The first one is that I actually think that I thought too small when I was running Fanbytes. I think mentally I thought too small. Our first ever campaign was £300 from Go Ape. And I remember calling out my co-founder and being so excited, even though before that, 4 years before that, I had sold Entrepreneur Express for, I think in total, I got paid 70 grand and then a bonus payment of 40. So in all, 110 grand. But that £300 to me was like, oh my God, that's so amazing.
Yeah, it's a different feeling, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I think I got so I think we thought too small, to be honest. This was early on in the journey. And then I think what I just started to do was I started to actually package up our services in, bronze, silver, gold. And gold was always the one where I would just put it in there to see if they took it. I think the first ever person who then took it, I thought, oh, okay, it is possible for us to sell things at 100 grand. I think, I'm trying to remember who that was. I think that was a toy brand that we worked with. And I thought, wow, okay, the big boys are here. And then subsequently, I then just kept telling the sales team, add that in more. And pricing is one of those things where the more that you have undeniable proof that you can service something at a certain price point, the more that becomes the base level, right? And so we just kept doing that, and then that kept scaling. So that was the journey of pricing that we really went through.
Got it. Yeah, and just to clarify again, that 100K example you said there, that would still be a project based, all right? So what duration of time would that be roughly?
I don't know. That could differ. I remember when I was running it, some makeup brand would say we are producing. In fact, some film brand would come in and say, right, we have a film. Here's 100 grand. We need this to be spent in the next 72 hours. And then, some other e-com brands would be like, here's 100 grand. We want this to be for the next 2 months. So got it. It really did differ.
Cool. All right, cool. And then just the last part on that, and I'm going into specific details here, but I think it's useful. That 100 grand is being paid just to you guys, and then there's a budget separate for paying influencers, or how does that generally work?
So that's that 100 grand. Yeah. So that 100 grand would involve that. And then what we did, which was good, was that we were able, having ran several hundreds, probably in my time at Fanbytes, we probably ran like 1,000 influencer campaigns, like thousands. You get so much data as to what would perform, what would not perform, how it would perform, that if you said, right, here is 100 grand, I want to figure out how many clicks we can get, etc. I could say, well, okay, well, not me, but the team could say, right, yeah, I think that will require 50 influencers, and these are the type of influencers, etc. So over time, it really became something which is very instinctive based off a lot of data that we built.
Yeah. And sorry, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly though. So that is that's their budget to spend on influencers for the campaign. What percentage do you guys take from a campaign like that? Is it probably an easier way to be more specific?
Right.
Like, I'm
That
just like
just
how you guys
depended.
make money in that sort of deal.
Yes. So how it worked was that a portion of that would then come to us, and then a portion of that will go to the influencers. But that like differed
That
across the
varies a
board,
lot
really.
by. Is
Yeah.
there like general rough ranges? So, for example, in my world of paid, if I'm managing a budget of $1 million a month, my agency can charge between, general agency can be 8% on the low end. Like if you're a massive agency, you might be able to do that all the way up to 20% sometimes. So is there like rough
Yeah, I
ranges
think.
within influencer world that are
Oh
equivalent?
man, that's the thing that was interesting about the influencer world, was that it was kind of the Wild West sometimes. Like you had people who could do, 10%. You could have people who could do, I mean, there is a company in the space right now who is doing 75%. Like they're taking 75% of the overall spend.
Damn, that's wild.
Yeah. So it's
So
a
it
bit
just
of
varies a
a
lot. It
mishmash.
seems like it's because obviously it's a younger part of the industry, so it's probably less like general benchmarks or whatever. Whereas like
Yeah.
paid ads have been going on since way before digital, right? It's like it
Yeah.
comes from traditional media. All right, cool. That's helpful to know. And then you talked about inbound. So you said 92% of your leads came from inbound through content marketing, which is obviously amazing. And I'm assuming in that might be referrals too, or is referrals
Yeah,
separate?
referrals was definitely a key part of it, but like inbound was definitely quite good.
You mentioned the inbound leads will come in mostly from content marketing. Obviously, that was your background as well. You built a blog and stuff before, so you know that world pretty well. But you were saying there's referrals too as a part of that. I'm sure your existing clients or people that you know would refer you. But
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm trying to think. So I'm not sure that we broke anything out by referrals or anything like that. I think when we're talking about new business, we're talking about someone who doesn't know about Fanbytes and how they then became part of our world,
got it.
right?
Yeah.
And that's very different to someone who has already worked with us, etc. So here we're primarily talking about new business, and that was all driven by content and content marketing as well.
Cool. Last thing on that, on the content marketing side, you mentioned earlier blog posts, webinars. Like
Yeah.
what did that content mix look like for you? And was it
Yeah.
like creating these anchor pieces of content through long blog posts, and then getting
Yeah.
people onto email lists, and then upselling them onto join our webinar where we're going to teach you about influencer marketing? Is that the sort of vibe
Yeah.
it was?
So I think that was one of our big funnels. Because really I just learned a lot of, there's a guy called Jay Abraham, really, really
Yeah.
smart guy. And one of his whole things is taking strategies and tactics that have worked in other industries and then transcending them into a different industry. I think that was definitely something that I took, right? I'm not a huge fan of these scammy internet marketers, but when you hear something like Russell Brunson took a company, ClickFunnels, from 0 to 100 million in revenue in 4 years, you go, well, there's something he's doing right.
Yeah.
And so that really got me into the whole world of building funnels and lead gen and all that stuff. So an example funnel could be, we are trying to get into, let's say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of one. We were trying to get into the fashion community and the fashion industry and to get those brands in. Rather than just emailing ASOS and all those guys, we'd create content around fashion brands and Gen Z. We'd share it with them. They would then download it. We'd get their email, and then we'll put them through a lead sequence, and then our salespeople get in touch, really. So that's
And
a very
then
good example.
would there be? Yeah, that's a great example. And then you mentioned webinar though, so
Yeah.
like, is that something? Because like even for like stuff I've done, my missus in the other room there, she also has a paid social agency, and something we've done is we've taught like General Assembly. Don't know if you use General Assembly in the UK, but
I've
the General
heard of it,
Assembly,
yeah.
and then she's actually partnered with Shopify, and so she'll go and give these
Nice.
in-person talks and stuff like that for e-commerce specifically. So I think that's actually a really interesting one. Obviously, it's less scalable than jumping on a computer and doing it all online, but there's like pros and cons to both. Well, I'm curious to hear about like the press side and getting out there beyond just the funnels? Because I saw, you were on the BBC. There's a bunch of different podcasts you did. I'm sure you've done lots of speeches and talks at events. Did you find that stuff helped, or was that more just like social proof, I'm on the BBC sort of vibe?
No. So I think at the beginning of Fanbytes, especially when we were starting in the early stages of the influencer trend, it required you to persuade people more than just, hey, do you want to do a campaign? And the way to
educate them on what it was as well, right? They didn't even know what it was.
Exactly. And obviously that can't be really translated in an email. It needs to be in person. And so in the first few years, it really was me going on stage talking about these sort of things. And then subsequently, the PR stuff came as a consequence of Fanbytes doing interesting things. So whether it was Bloomberg or the whole Forbes 30 under 30 thing, and like all of that came as a consequence of the fact that Fanbytes kept doing cool things and we kept being mentioned as thought leaders in the space. So then that drove further opportunity. But at the beginning, it was a way to cut through the noise, because you realize that actually, because it's something quite new, it's pretty difficult to just convey over.
Creating a media plan, whatever, right? And then you're hiring people and training them on what you know. So I'm curious, like, what that was like for you in terms of stages, because I think a lot of people get to the next stage where they're like, oh, I'm going to hire a freelancer, or I'm going to hire a full-time employee, and they're going to be an account manager or whatever. And so, like, what was that process for you growing out the team?
So I think I did a terrible job at the beginning hiring people, like an absolute terrible job. And I look back on some of the mistakes I made and I go, well, that was such a donut move. And the reason why, quite frankly, is I think in the early stages, I had too much of an ego, and my ego was very much around, I want to make sure things are done the way that I would do them. And seeing someone doing a slightly different way was like, no, you're not doing it in that way. So a couple of things that I learned around hiring and all that stuff was, as much as you can, you want to hire top down. So as much as you can, you want to hire 1 to hire 10 rather than hiring 10. I think earlier on, I hired 10. So by that, I mean, I would I'll be like, right, okay, we need more sales people. Let me go and find a sales exec, a junior sales exec, and then try and train them up, etc. Whereas what I should have done was I said, spend some time to think about, well, rather than trying to solve the short-term problem, how can I build a sales department? And then go and get someone who could build a sales department. Not the most expensive person, but someone who had the potential to go and build a sales department. Whereas what I instead did was I'd hire someone junior who can just do the admin work, know fully well they can't really grow to become someone who could lead the sales team or do all that stuff. And by doing that, I was basically hamstringing myself. I was just playing at a level I was comfortable with.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one. I think hiring 1 to hire 10. And then I think also, as much as you can, being able to get people who have already done this before is very, very key. And being able to figure out how to incentivize them and get a value of the upside, I think that's also incredibly key. And that was something I learned much later on. There's something that I call the curse of the founder. And the curse of the founder is basically when you think, because you are driven and motivated and can figure things out, you think that everyone is also like that. So you hire people and you think they will have the same level of drive and ambition and everything to solve problems as you. But then you get frustrated because they're not actually doing it. And you go, why are you not doing it? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is because they obviously do not own as much of the business as you. So
they should not care as much as you do. That's you could see me laughing there, right? Because I was silently laughing to myself because I felt the same in the past. Yeah.
And so, they should not care as much as you. And that is completely fine because no one will care as much as the founders. And the other reason why it occurs is because you then have to figure out how to create ways for them to progress as much as they can and grow as much as they can if they're not getting as much of the upside as you. And that was something that I figured out later on, which I wish I had figured out slightly earlier.
Could you give an example of a donut move, as you called it? You said that earlier.
Oh, man.
The way you really were doing something silly.
So many things. So there was a guy who we hired and he was great. He was great. In fact, I actually saw him last week randomly and I was with a friend. And afterwards I said, my biggest regret was that I didn't keep that guy because he would have been phenomenal. So a donut move is, for example, this guy was great and we moved him into a head of campaigns role. And at that time, we were probably 12 people and he had a bunch of ideas about how to do things. And rather than like giving him the freedom to do things and experiment, I would be like, no, that's silly. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. And I would do it in a public forum. And it was so stupid, but also I was 22 then. And my entire perspective of business was you have to be kind of a dick to get things done because I'd read that, Steve Jobs was a dick. And so just like very juvenile ways of thinking. But that was a very specific example of basically a donut move. And another donut move.
I like the phrase donut move, by the way. This is we've coined a new one here. Yeah.
Another donut move was like not letting people go the moment that I knew it wasn't right. And I'm sure a lot of founders can empathize with this, but this was something which I did. And I just hate the fact that there were so many times the person was not right. They knew they weren't right. The whole team knew that they weren't right. And I'm a pretty yeah, exactly. And I'm a pretty upfront person. Like I'm a pretty kind of straightforward person. But for some reason, I did not want to have that conversation. And I hated the fact that like in that moment, I squirmed too much. And so those were two donut moves. And that second one about basically not making the call, I do that a lot. And it changed. I think after year 4, I basically just became a big boy. I was like, come on, man, just make the call because it doesn't matter. And I think from that decision making was when my entire perspective changed.
Yeah, that's a good one. And you mentioned, I think that the thing I've noticed too is like the public forum, especially nowadays, everyone working in Slack. And like in public forum doesn't have to be you're all in an office, someone's getting shouted out in person, right? Like I actually find Slack, very helpful in some ways, but incredibly distracting for like I work with a lot of startups and I go in their Slack sometimes and I'm like, people are just in here that like anyone can ask a question, especially for marketing, right? Like an engineer pulls a piece of random anecdotal piece of data and it's like, hey, why is the retention low on this one tiny little sliver of this massive campaign? They don't know any context, whatever. And then it's like 50 messages going back and forth on like why that's the case, and it's like a waste of resources, right? So but anyway, that's an interesting one. You also mentioned there ego and maturity, and completely fair enough, right? Like you're 22 years old. Hopefully people can give you some grace when you're 22. The stuff we were all doing at that age, we got to realize that sometimes you're going to make those mistakes. But I'm curious, like, was there anything that really helped you see that? Or did someone call you out? Was there anything that you're like, okay, like, was there a moment?
So I think
like, what happened?
The whole thing around ego is for a lot of first-time founders, and I guess I wasn't a first-time founder, but this was the first time that I'd run a business of this scale. You're learning a lot of things and you're figuring out a lot of things from first principles. And because of that, that's good. But also because of that, you may get the sense that you actually know everything, because you're solving problems and you're like, wow, I'm a genius for getting that. I'm a genius for getting that. When really the truth is, it was probably the most basic thing ever, and you just figured out how to do it. So I think when I realized and I started surrounding myself with more accomplished entrepreneurs, and I'd say it's also when I started speaking a lot more and forming better relationships with a lot of my investors. And they really talk to me about what I'll call big boy business. You know, they talk about bigger deals, bigger structures, how to think about business in a way. And I'd go, man, I don't know much. And that kind of humility from going, you know, that kind of humility from saying, you know, I think Drake or Meek Mill has a song which is there's levels to this, right? And like knowing there is levels to this made me a lot more considerate and humble, which again was something that happened. You know, we ran the business for like 5.5 years. I'd say that happened about halfway in, where I thought, do you know what? If I want to build this business game and if I want to stay in this business game for the rest of my life, then the subsequent company I run after this and companies after this should be bigger than this. And so if I'm having an ego about what in the grand scheme of things is a small company compared to what I want to do generally in my life, then there's no way I'll be able to get on to the next levels.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think, like finding those people that can kind of keep you accountable is quite important too, like without necessarily like ruining your confidence or messing you up mentally. Because a lot of people don't realize, like, just to be frank, from the, you know, I've met like hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs, from people just starting up to billionaires, and like most of them have a chip on their shoulder. And I say that in like a good way. I probably have the same, right? And often is the reason what drives you initially is there's something there which is saying, I'm going to prove the world wrong, or I'm going to prove my value. And it might always be such a negative thing, but a lot of the time it comes from, I see the world in a certain way, I can create something that doesn't exist in the world. And that takes a crazy amount of delusion in a way, and confidence, right? Like, and so that is the one side. The other side is those people obviously end up creating really incredible things. But what people don't also realize is, like, during that phase of growth, like you're still that same person, right? And things have grown, but you're still developing mentally, especially at such a young age. And so, like, I was looking at I'm 34, going to be 35 in a few months. And I was looking at some emails I'd sent, man, at like 19. I was, I'd started a little small company as a 16-year-old too. And man, I was like so embarrassed. Like, and they weren't even that bad. If I sent that now, I'd be like, who was that kid? And so, like, you got to realize, like, okay, when you're 21, you got to give some, even when you're not 21, to be honest, whatever age you are, you got to give people a little grace for that. I know we're hitting time now, so we might have to wrap up. How are you doing for time? Have you got a hard stop? Let's roll. All right, cool. Let's just keep it. I did want to ask a little bit more about, first of all, thanks for sharing that. That was actually really interesting to hear. On the influencer marketing side, we're obviously not going to be able to dissect everything there is to know about influencer marketing, but we talked about how some of those campaigns worked earlier, but I wanted to go into a bit more detail, more like forward looking. And so if you're looking at companies that are kind of like best in class at executing influencer marketing campaigns, are there a few sort of like example campaigns that come to mind for you, and like what to demonstrate what a good influencer marketing campaign looks like?
The best influencer campaigns are always the ones that are very integrated. So by that, I mean, they don't live in their silo. So if you're doing an influencer campaign, it needs to make sure that your paid social also matches up, your content matches up, your SEO, just all that stuff is integrated. And the truth is, large companies do not do this that well. And the reason why large companies don't do this that well is because they treat influencer marketing like just a tick box exercise.
Like another channel, right? Yeah.
Yeah. The ones that I've seen do this very well actually tend to be the ones which are run by young people. So, for example, I don't know his name. I think his name might be... I don't know what his name is, but basically it's this guy on Twitter, for example, who runs a sword brand. It's like I saw this. Yeah.
They talked about it on My First Million, right? I think if you
Right.
heard that.
And I
Yeah.
see that like the influencer campaigns, I just go, that's so intelligent because they match it all up from the influencers they use to the creatives they use to the type of content that they put out, all the way to the landing page. So they're probably, there probably isn't some specific company I can point out does as well,
Yeah.
or
It's
apart
more
from
the
that
style of
guy's
it, which
sword brand. But I think it's the style that there needs to be some congruency across everything, which especially large companies, they just are not able to do, because
yeah, that's a good
it
point.
takes a lot of coordination and it takes a lot of strategy, and in a lot of companies it is just a tick box.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think even from my side, like working with a lot of those bigger companies, it's everyone has good intentions, but a lot of the time, like there's a vision at one level, whether that's the CMO or whoever, but by the time it trickles down and you've just got more people, everyone has their own success, like KPIs essentially. And like the best example I can think of is that's just coming to mind is like in the 2010s, when early on, when e-commerce, you were still convincing people to run paid ads on Google and Facebook. Now obviously everyone understands you should be doing that. But there would be an e-commerce team, and then there would be the rest of the marketing team, and the e-commerce team would say, hey, I am only getting paid on my bonus based on how many sales I drive on the .com. And then we were seeing from our data, right, like 60% of people were going on site and then going in the store and buying something. And we were like, well, we want to give you credit for this. And there weren't the attribution tools available at the time to go to the CMO and say, hey, your digital ads aren't just driving this 5% of revenue online, it's all this other value it's adding. So I found that is often the case. It's just people not being aligned in that way. Now, when it comes to actually executing a campaign, if you were advising, like, let's say a small to medium-sized business, they're just trying to test out working with influencers. Maybe they've got a product they sell, they're a D2C brand, or they've got a few locations in somewhere. Like, how does it actually work nowadays? I mean, obviously you can go to an agency and work with someone like your company, but a lot of people try doing this themselves. So is it a matter of literally reaching out to influencers directly in DMs, or is it, I'm just curious what the actual process looks like.
Yeah, I mean, just do that. I mean, if you're testing out, then you don't need huge amount of strategy. What you just need is tactics, right? And so tactics, you start working with a few influencers, smaller ones, work with them, measure their engagement to see how well they're doing. And then if it works, then you scale up from there.
Yeah, and the reason I'm getting tactical here, getting in the weeds, is just more like for someone who's actually trying to figure it out, like in terms of, because I think me and you kind of know a little bit, but you obviously know 100 times more about influencer marketing, but it's very obvious, like, oh, you could create a list of people you want to reach out to, but like, what do some of those deals look like for an influencer? Like, is it like I've heard on other podcasts and stuff like that where they would say you start off, let's say you've got a D2C brand, you might start off by just giving out free products to people, and you're not necessarily even asking, and you're not even saying, hey, you have to post. It's just, hey, we want to share it with people that we think might like it. If you want to post, great. But if not, like, it's completely fair enough. Is that still the case? Like, that's kind of like the entry level of...
Yeah, so I think seeding, that's what you're talking about. I think seeding at the base level is actually the way to start if you don't have a large budget. But I think that you almost want to... that you want to seed, but show that you have some traction. So, for example, if you're going to seed, let's say on TikTok, for example, probably have a TikTok account first, which is creating some content, and then seed it there. And then seed with TikTok influencers, get their content, which you can then use on your own profile, and then go to the next level up of influencers. And then those people would have seen the prior influence activity that you've done. And then suddenly people who would maybe have charged you will say, right, actually, I can do this for free because it feels like we're part of a wave. And now eventually you get to some position where you can't do for free, but that's fine. I mean, that's the bigger leagues there. But to start off with, you can just do what I said.
That's normal to seed. And then is there, again, like a typical range that if I'm starting to pay people that I should be aware of, like, you know, in let's say podcast land, there's a $18 to $25 or $50 sometimes, depending on premium nature of the pod, CPM. So for every 1,000 people that listen, you can charge that as an ad.
Yeah.
Is there like general benchmarks around that for influencers?
I
or is
actually
it...
do not know, and that's
okay.
And the reason I say I do not know is actually because I actually, like, all that stuff was done by the guys.
No, that makes sense. So you haven't been doing that for a while.
No,
cool.
Yeah.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I appreciate that. All right, cool. And just let's wrap things up here. I did want to ask that little tactical question there before we wrap up. And when I heard the kind of general theme of what we've talked about today, it was a lot of different things. But when we spoke before this, you had talked about wanting to talk about the understanding the long-term game with company building. And I'm curious what that means for you. Like, because you know you're still a fairly young guy in the grand scheme of, you know, business and life, hopefully, for all of us. But so I'm curious, like, for you, as you look to long term, like, you've already had 1 or 2 good successes there. What does that look like for you looking forward when you're thinking about building a company long term?
Yeah, so one of the questions I got a lot when the company was acquired, right, was, why did you sell it, right? And I mean, there are a bunch of reasons for that. One was, I did think that for Fanbytes to get to the next level of growth, it needed to be inside of a bigger company, right? And so, you know, Brain Labs as an acquisition made sense. There was market consolidation, blah, blah. I mean, on a personal side, it was more like, well, if you think about it, this was something that I started at 21. And this is something that I knew that in the long game of business actually would set me up to play the next few games of business on what I call on cheat mode, right? Because there are not, if anyone, there are not many people who basically, you know, at the age of 27, which I was last year, can say, right, so I built a company from 0 to 75 people. I sold it in an 8-figure transaction, and it was all, you know, kosher. There was no like crazy stuff going. This is actually a legitimate acquisition that we had, and it was pretty crazy. When you go into a room and you say that, the doors open crazily. Like, where there is VCs, where there's PEs, where there's co-founders, where there's future team members and all that stuff.
Yeah, you've got a track record now. Yeah.
Yeah. And not just like, you know, a track record. Because one of the things that I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, and they'll be like, oh, I exited this, I exited that. And then you really ask them, and it's like, well, actually, they just left the company. So you didn't really exit it, right? But sell
that's a different type of exit. Yeah. Technically, they're all right, but not what you mean.
Exactly. But to sell a company is a very different kettle of fish. And so I think what I meant and what I mean by taking a long-term view on business is, I think not enough people realize that even after you are finished with a business, you think what you end up doing is just retiring and chilling on a beach. And I tried that even for like a month. I was like, you know what, let's kind of take things a bit more chill. And the truth is that would never really, really work. You would always want to do more things. And even with Brain Labs, when I was as like part of the transition period, I was like, right, I'm going to like help them to integrate, do all that stuff. And then it was like, well, yes, that counts as doing some kind of work, but it's nothing compared to the high tempo that you had when you were the person running the company. And taking a long-term view on business is basically saying, I understand how this business fits into my wider goal and plan. Like, for example, saying that I got this acquisition at this point means it'd be easier for me to then go do subsequent businesses. And then for those subsequent businesses, winning that game would mean it'd be easier for me to do subsequent other businesses and projects. So that's what I mean by taking a long-term game on life. And I feel so many people, maybe it's because they read about the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, they almost don't have an end goal in mind for anything that they're doing. They just think this is going to be the thing that identifies them for the rest of their life. And I think that is a very bad decision.
On that, Timo, you said, you know, one of the things I've noticed interviewing lots of people where they've gone up to the next level is that is amazing in terms of business. But when it comes to where business and your work play a role in your overall life, I found as you get older, especially for me and a lot of people I've spoken to, your priorities shift, right? And so when I was 16, I started a company too. And I was like, all I want to do is start a company and forever. This one I'm going to do business, is what I care about. And then as I got older, I was like, actually, there are other things in my life that I really care about. And and I'm sure you have those things too. But I'm curious, like, as you think longer term, what are those... like, what do you feel like there's ever an end essentially to that kind of logic? Because to me, it can almost be like a negative thing too, where it just, you're never satisfied, you know? So curious how you think about it.
So I think that you're probably right in that there comes a point where actually the hustle and the grind and the yearn for more achievement is not actually the biggest driving force. But I also am saying this as a 28-year-old who has not started a family yet and all that stuff. But I don't see where that will end for me. And I think for me, I am trying to live by my own scorecard. So by that, I mean, for example, with Fanbytes, I didn't try and delude myself to say that it would be worth hundreds of millions. And that was because I had an internal scorecard, which basically was like, okay, by the age of being 30, I want to achieve this amount in my bank account. And then I would know that I have one, basically. And then my subsequent things, everything I do now in any future businesses, it's not being driven by this goal of just making as much money as possible. It's actually being driven because I want to have as much optionality in my life, and I want to be able to do things because I just find them interesting. So, of course, I'm sure at some point, if and when I start another company, it would be primarily, I would want to win that game. I would want to win that game because naturally I'm a competitive person. I don't know what that business will be, and I haven't even really quite like gone into the detail of it, of like thinking through it. But I know that at least it will be coming from a position of like having a bunch of options rather than it being, I need to achieve this to prove to myself that I can achieve it. And I think actually for Fanbytes, that was where a lot of my drive came from, where I felt I needed to achieve this to prove to myself that I was worth something and that I could be the person who could achieve that. And for subsequent things, it's not going to be.
That's a fair point. That was interesting what you said about the hitting a certain number in your bank account, right? Because I think I have had that too. And so you might not know as much about my background, but I also grew up in London. And for me, being told, you know, we watched Only Fools and Horses, growing up. And I don't know if you ever watched Only Fools and Horses, but it would always be like, one day we're going to be millionaires, right? That was the phrase. And to be fair, millionaire in the 80s or 90s is way different to today, right? Because the value of currency. But to me, that was just, I didn't know anyone who made more than 30K a year pretty much, or like 30, 40K. And it was just like, that to me, like, success was like, oh, I can get a job where, you know, I went to a decent uni where everyone's applying for finance and consultancy jobs, and the starting salary was like 33K at Accenture or at a bank or whatever, right? And so that to me, I was like, wow, I can already earn that in my first job. That would be amazing, right? And And then as you kind of, like you said, level up, you meet other people, you start understanding, and there's actually a lot more information to see. Like, oh, this is how you make six figures. This is how you get to $1 million more or whatever. And it becomes a bit more of a reality. That's also something, to be honest, I've really struggled with mentally, especially coming from my background. And I don't want to say ours because I don't know your family's, you know, background. But that was a thing for me where I'm like, to be very frank, and I'm kind of being careful what I say here, but when I hit certain financial numbers too, there was this weird, almost anticlimax where I'm like, wow, like this is something I've always wanted or I've strived for. I want to be able to feel financially free or whatever. But then you're like, okay, is that it? You know, it's like my life wasn't different the first day or the after the second day. So has that happened too much as well? I'm just curious, as someone who's had a success where you actually made a good amount of money there, where you're like, actually, this is cool, but maybe that was a little overrated.
100%. Like so many of my friends actually say this as well. I remember the day that we signed the terms, like the final share purchase agreement. It was late at night on a Friday, and I and my CTO Mitch, he signed, and then Ambrose signed, and then I then finally signed, and then we get this DocuSign thing in our email which says like all parties have signed, and I go, wow, that's just made me a multi-millionaire. I was like, oh my God. And then I just went to bed and I went to the gym the next day. And I just thought, man, nothing has changed. And one of the things I actually thought about, I was speaking to my friend about this because he's also been through a couple of exits. And he said the same thing. It's like the day afterwards, you want to just kind of shout and be like, guys, this happened. Like just you want to start a podcast? just shout in Sainsbury's and just let people like, guys, I'm rich, right?
Yeah.
But then it's like, well, the world just goes on, life just goes on.
Yeah.
And that perspective is very shape-shifting. And actually, someone told me this before, and he said, for the first month, you will feel invisible. And then you would go, actually, there is always more things to be done. And you'll be walking out in Sainsbury's and you'll be going to Asda and Tesco and going to your gym. And in the back of your mind, you will know, oh my God, I am so grateful, but also there is more life to live, basically.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I love that, man. I'm glad I asked that question because I think it's some of the more things that go through the mind that are more interesting sometimes, because it is a weird journey. It's not like a normal journey where you're just, I got this job and then I got promoted and then you get the next one. It's like you might be kind of broke for a while and then you get a massive win. And, so it's a very different feeling. So anyway, man, I know we've gone a little bit over time here, so I appreciate all the time. And for people... Well, I'll just keep it real. We were having some technical difficulties. I've done hundreds of podcasts, and today was for some reason the weirdest one. And you'll see people on YouTube. My webcam is different to usual, so for that reason. But anyway, thanks for being here, man. And when I'm in London, I'll definitely give you a shout so we can say hello. Please do the same if you're in New York. Cool. And hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again sometime. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for you, man.
Cool, man. Sweet. Sounds good.
Appreciate you coming on. Cheers, man. Have a good one.